Yes.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Freund. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chair.
Are you ready?
We are indeed.
Okay, let's start.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, as I believe you know, we propose to lead today 4 witnesses. We're going to be departing a little from the nature of the evidence heard thus far by this stream. Thus far, we've really been hearing from people in and around Parliament about what did and didn't happen at certain times. The focus today will be slightly different. The focus will be from what one might call observers who, as it were, wish to contribute to the work of the Commission by giving their analysis as to what they believe went wrong, if anything went wrong, and what they believe perhaps could be suggested as potential measures to help to address the problem from occurring in future. We'll be starting with the evidence of Mr. Lawson Naidoo from CASAC. We will then hear the evidence of Professor Corder. We will then hear the evidence of a representative of the Parliamentary Monitoring Group, Ms. Jennifer Rold-Smith. And then finally this afternoon, the evidence of Mr. Lewis from Corruption Watch. Chair, with your leave, I wish to call the first witness, Mr. Lawson Naidoo.
Yes, thank you.
His evidence can be found in volume 3 from page 204 and following. It's exhibit ZZ10.
Thank you, I've got it. Thank you. Mr. Naidoo, are you there?
Good morning, Chair. Yes, I am. Thank you.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Very well, Deputy Chief Justice.
Thank you very much. And thank you for availing yourself to try and help the Commission. I know that you and your organization are big supporters of the Commission and its work, and we appreciate that very much. So I'm very grateful that you have availed yourself to try and assist the Commission.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Freund?
Sorry, Chair, I was just going to say I suggest that maybe we should ask for Mr. Naidoo to be sworn in.
Yes, the registrar will now either administer the oath or the affirmation. Mr. Naidoo, if you speak, then you will come back onto the screen.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, all right. Yeah, the registrar will administer either the oath or affirmation, depending which one you prefer.
The affirmation, Chair.
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
Paramananda Lawson Naidoo.
Do you have any objection to making the prescribed affirmation?
No.
Do you affirm that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, I truly affirm.
I truly affirm.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Freund, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Naidoo, is it correct that under your direction, your organization, the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, commonly known as CASAC, prepared and submitted a report to the Commission?
That is correct, Mr. Freund.
And is that the report we find in bundle 3 at page 206 and following?
That is correct.
It's a report entitled "Why the National Assembly Failed to Exercise Effective Oversight in Respect of State Capture." Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is it correct, if you go to bundle 3, page 205.1 and following, that you signed a brief confirmatory affidavit in relation to that report?
I did indeed.
Chair, on that basis, may I move that Exhibit ZZ10 be admitted as formally as an exhibit before this commission?
The affidavit of Mr. Paramananda Lawson Naidoo, together with its annexures, and the affidavit appears at page 205.1, is admitted and will be marked as Exhibit ZZ10.
Thank you, Chair. May I proceed?
Yes, you may proceed.
Mr. Naidoo, I just want to take you briefly through one of the aspects in the confirmatory affidavit itself. It's correct, is it not, that you are the Executive Secretary of CASAC?
That is correct, Mr. Freund.
Perhaps if you could just describe very briefly what that job entails and the nature and duration of your experience in CASAC, but I emphasize very briefly.
Indeed. CASAC was established in September 2010. I have been the Executive Secretary of the organization since its inception for over 10 years now. And CASAC's main focus is to promote the basis of our constitutional democracy in South Africa, focusing primarily on issues of public accountability, constitutional awareness, and broadly holding public officials to account, and seeking to strengthen the work of institutions of governance.
And in that, for that purpose and in that capacity, you, together with colleagues, were instrumental in preparing the report that we're going to be discussing this morning.
That is correct.
And the ultimate objective, as I understand it, of the report is to try to analyze, as it were, to try to understand if something went wrong, why that happened, from the perspective of effective parliamentary oversight, and then drawing on that to make suggestions as to what issues should be considered to try to redress the problem. Would that be a fair summary?
That would be a fair summary, yes.
Just for purposes of the record, if I could take you to page 205.2 and to paragraph 5 of your confirmatory affidavit. The report we're going to come to shortly, we've already referred to. I just draw attention to the fact that you indicate in your confirmatory affidavit that there are annexures to your report, the first of which is the report by Professor Hugh Corder and others, and that is not annexed to your affidavit because it appears elsewhere in the bundle. Chair, that's in the reference bundle from pages 49 and following. And then secondly, you annex as Annexure 2 a document that discusses a dedicated anti-corruption agency that is annexed to your report, and that, Chair, is at pages 257 to 267. Is that correct, Mr. Naidoo?
That is indeed correct, Mr. Freund.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to turn now to the substance of your report. And if I may say so, it starts with a very helpful set of references both to the statutory underpinning and constitutional underpinning of oversight and some of the principles that emerge from the leading case law, particularly case law of the Constitutional Court on parliamentary oversight. And you've endeavoured to sketch the legal background, is that correct?
That is correct, yes. We put into context the issues of Parliament's responsibilities with regards to executive oversight.
Now, in the interests of time and bearing in mind that the Chair, as the Deputy Chief Justice, is reasonably familiar with the provisions of the Constitution and of the case law to which you refer, I'm not going to be taking you in any detail through that material, although we are grateful because it does assist to kind of focus the mind. But if I can just ask you generally, if one looks at the question of the adequacy of the powers and the adequacy of the legal instruments, well, let's stop, let me rephrase this. Whether the existing legislation, in your opinion, confers sufficiently clearly adequate powers on the legislature to exercise oversight. What in broad view is your view?
I would agree with that. Both the Constitution and legislation, as well as the rules of Parliament, the rules of the National Assembly, would appear to provide clear guidance on what is required of Parliament, what its responsibilities are in respect of oversight of the executive and organs of state. And I think the law and the rules are clear in that regard. And so our view is that the Constitution, the law and the rules are not an impediment in themselves to effective oversight.
Right. And in addition to focusing on the Constitution, statutory provisions and rules of the National Assembly, you've also drawn attention to Parliament's own governing policy document, the Oversight and Accountability Model. You deal with that from paragraph 47 and following of your report. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And again, Chair, just for your convenience, that is to be found in the reference bundle, pages 1 to 48. And what you do in the next few pages of your report is to highlight some of the core views and commitments that one finds in what has become known as the OVAC report adopted by Parliament in 2004. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I want to pick up the threads from that point onwards in your affidavit. In other words, I'm going from page 223 and following in bundle 3. And what you do over the few pages that follow is to draw attention to certain of the key decisions of the Constitutional Court on the question of parliamentary oversight. Perhaps you might like just to, as it were, summarize what you see to be the very gist of the right or the duty of Parliament to exercise oversight over the executive as it emerges from that case law, in your understanding.
Well, I think what the jurisprudence tells us, and I think it's quite instructive for Parliament, is that matters that have come before the courts, particularly matters that have come before the courts in recent years, have clarified what the constitutional provisions regarding Parliament's responsibilities are, how members of Parliament are expected to exercise those powers of oversight and scrutinizing executive action, and giving meaning and content to those rights and responsibilities. And those matters have on occasion come before the courts because there were disputes in Parliament between political parties as to what the nature of those responsibilities were and how Parliament should, in a constitutionally compliant manner, execute its mandate. So I think the jurisprudence from the courts is very instructive in elaborating on what the responsibilities of members of Parliament are.
And it seems from a reading of your report that you seem to be of the view that the very fact that a number of these cases were considered to be necessary demonstrates that there had been some measure of failure of oversight, which is what prompted the very decisions that you cite.
Indeed, that is true. We make the point, I think, that it's the very failure of Parliament to resolve many of these issues which concerns the workings and the functioning of Parliament, which Parliament is given the discretion in terms of the Constitution to develop its own rules and orders to ensure its smooth functioning. But where there are disputes and they have not been capable of being resolved within the political structures of Parliament, they have landed up before the courts. Some of those issues are perhaps issues that are not appropriate for judicial judgment, insofar as issues such as the use of unparliamentary language and the like, which are matters we don't necessarily cite in this report, but which are matters that have come before the courts. Others have been more fundamental issues about oversight, about what the powers of the Speaker are in relation to certain matters that come before Parliament, when motions of no confidence and impeachment motions need to be discussed, and what the powers of Parliament are in relation to reports from Chapter 9 institutions and specifically reports from the Office of the Public Protector.
Yes, and I think one of the most famous cases to which you refer is the case that arose out of the Public Protector's report on Nkandla and the manner in which Parliament, through various structures, dealt with that, resulting in a finding by the Constitutional Court that Parliament had failed in its constitutional obligations of oversight. And do you want to just touch on that very, very briefly?
Again, yes, I mean, I think this was a seminal case in many respects, and it was the failure of Parliament to properly deal with the report of the Public Protector entitled Secure and Comfort, relating to former President Zuma's residence. And Parliament's failure to properly process that report, and instead seeking to substitute its own findings for that of the Public Protector, was found by the Constitutional Court to be unconstitutional and a dereliction of the constitutional responsibility of Parliament to hold the President to account. So I think, again, coming back to what I said earlier, it was a judgment that was instructive to Parliament in how it needs to go about in exercising its oversight mandates. And I think the issue that arises is what has Parliament done in relation to many of these judgments to absorb the advice and judgments of the Constitutional Court in many respects, and adapt its workings to conform with those clarifications of the law.
Right. Now, I'd like to take you to page 228 of your report, where you commence dealing with something that becomes a theme that runs through this report, which is to focus on the role of the Speaker of the National Assembly. Now, I don't wish, and I don't believe the Commission wishes, to get immersed into controversy about a whole number of issues of detail here of the Speaker's role in any particular incident. But you have some views on the general principle of Speaker impartiality, and I'd be interested if you could just elaborate on that, please.
Yes, I mean, this is drawn in part from a previous report that was commissioned by CASAC in 2015, which looked at the state of Parliament at that time. And I think in contextualizing how Parliament has responded to many of these issues in the period that we're referring to, which is largely the tenure of the Fifth Parliament from 2014 to 2019, I think it's important to place it in the context of the disruptions that occurred in Parliament following the 2014 national elections, and Parliament's difficulty in dealing with those issues as they arose. And many of those brought into sharp focus questions around the impartiality of the Speaker in dealing with those protests within Parliament, dealing with requests for Parliament to properly exercise its oversight, in particular over the President. And so I think in those respects, and this is it's common knowledge, been reported extensively by the media. The role of the Speaker was called into question. The impartiality of the Speaker was called into question. Suggestions that the Speaker was using her power to protect the President, and it resulted in, I think, in the first time in certainly the history of a democratic parliament in South Africa, of a motion of no confidence being brought against the Speaker. So I think that sets the context and the concerns that were being raised by members of parliament, opposition parties, but I think also the broader South African public, because the role of the Speaker as an impartial chair of the most important plenary forum of our elected representatives needs to be a position that is beyond reproach, that needs to exercise functions independently and impartially. And in the South African context, one accepts the fact that the Speaker is drawn from a political party and is a politician and a member of parliament in his or her own right. But how they exercise the power as a Speaker should be in a manner that commands the respect from across all of the parties that are represented in that assembly.
And is it your assessment that this issue is relevant when one considers the extent to which Parliament succeeded or failed in the Fifth Parliament in holding the executive to account in relation to allegations of alleged state capture, alleged corruption?
It did, and I think we make the point in the report that it was the conduct of the Speaker that contributed towards the dysfunction of Parliament, that created the grounds for this, the breakdown of trust between political parties in the National Assembly. Parliament is a political forum. There's always going to be contestation, robust debate, disagreements. And it is the role of the Speaker to mediate those in the interests of finding a resolution and of Parliament coming to a decision on matters. But when the Speaker acts in a manner that is partisan and is seen to be favouring one political party or members of the executive, then it undermines not just the confidence of other political parties, but of the public at large in the constitutional ability of that institution to do what it is constitutionally mandated to do. And I think that has brought Parliament into Parliament's reputation into question, and it's something that cannot be healthy for a democracy in which Parliament is the primary mechanism or institution that holds executive power to account.
Now, I want to change focus. This commission has already heard evidence, and you also deal in your report with a central feature of our constitutional order, which is our closed list proportional representation system, and the impact that has on the exercise, as it were, of conscience by members of Parliament when voting on issues of high national concern. And you focus, if I can refer you to paragraph 69 of your report, you draw attention to two similar and related provisions in the Constitution. They are section 47(3)(c), and I believe you deal elsewhere with, it's 106.
What page did you say, Mr. Freund? I'm sorry. What page of the report?
232 in volume 3.
Okay, thank you.
Which is page 27 of the report itself, and I'm at paragraph 69. And that's one of the places in which you deal with this issue. There you refer to section 47(3)(c) of the Constitution, and that's the provision that provides that a person loses membership of the National Assembly if that person, and then I leave out some words and come to subparagraph C, ceases to be a member of the party that nominated that person as a member of the Assembly, and it continues. And there's a similar provision in section 106(3)(c) of the Constitution. Let me just read that. It provides likewise a person loses membership of a provincial legislature on terms really substantially the same as what I've just read to you. Now, would you like to comment on this issue generally, the problem of party discipline in a PR system, and then move on and make the submissions you wish to make on the advisability and relevance of those particular provisions of the Constitution?
Well, these two sections, Section 47.3c deals with the membership of the National Assembly, and 106.3c deals with it in the context of provincial legislatures, the same provision. But what it really recognizes is that in the closed party list system that we currently have, the seat in Parliament or in the provincial legislature belongs to the political party and not to the MP that is allocated that seat. And therefore, should a representative cease to be a member of the political party on whose list they were nominated to the legislature in question, they would lose that seat for whatever reason, whether they resign from the party or are expelled from the party. And this seems to place significant power in the hands of party bosses, in that they can use that as a mechanism to get members of parliament to toe the line, as it were, and to follow the party line on various issues. Now, in many respects, that's not an issue, because in any electoral system, political parties put forward a manifesto and the electorate votes on the basis of that manifesto. And if it's an issue of policy and a party uses its power to do that, it's commonly called using the whip to get party members to support a party position on a policy matter. Now, in that context, it's certainly not problematic. That is the very essence of a democracy, that the party winning an election has the right to implement its policy proposals in its manifesto. But where that power is used in Parliament, not on issues of substantive questions, but to abuse procedural rules and to use the majority of a political party to stifle or shut down debate and not allow a debate to even happen, that certainly undermines the role of Parliament and Parliament's ability to execute its constitutional mandate. If a debate on a particular issue were to happen, if an inquiry into corruption or alleged corruption in state-owned companies is conducted by Parliament, and there's disputes about whether there was corruption or not, and so on, the substantive decision taken after an investigation can certainly be along party lines, but the issue would have been aired in public, and the public would be able to make a finding of their own on the outcome of that process. So a distinction between the procedural rules and the substantive issue is one I wish to highlight. But I think the electoral system, as we currently have it, shows how that has been manipulated to undermine the role of Parliament and inhibit Parliament from truly exercising its oversight mandate. Now, almost simultaneously with making this submission to the Commission, which I think we did in July last year, just a few weeks before that, we had an important judgment from the Constitutional Court in the New Nation Movement matter, which declared certain sections of the Electoral Act inconsistent with the Constitution, and has given Parliament 24 months in which to amend those sections of the Electoral Act, which is likely to see us move away from a closed party list system, because the amendments to the Electoral Act will have to make provision for independent candidates to contest national and provincial elections in a manner that perhaps will be the same as in which they contest elections at local government level at the moment. But it does mean that Parliament is now seized with the issue of considering how to amend the Electoral Act and whether a new electoral model needs to be implemented in South Africa. The New Nation Movement judgment comes on the back of significant pressure in recent years for at least a discussion of around electoral reform and the need to change the current system because it places too much power in the hands of party officials over the conduct of MPs. It was an issue that was raised in the task team that was chaired by Dr. Van Zyl-Slabbert in the early 2000s. It was an issue that was reflected upon in the independent panel report on Parliament in 2008 or 9. and again in the high-level panel report that was chaired by former President Kgalema Motlanthe in 2018. So the time is certainly ripe for electoral reform.
If I could just stop you there, because I think the report of the high-level panel of 2018-19 probably hasn't received a great deal of attention, at least in these hearings. But there, once again, a structure, a committee appointed by Parliament to review Parliament's own success in the democratic era, once again propose that serious consideration should be given to electoral reform, somewhat along the lines first proposed in the Van Zyl-Slabbert report. Would that be correct?
That is indeed correct, yes.
And the nub of the argument, as I understand it, is that some type, there's no attack on the principle of proportional representation, but what some proponents are arguing is that it needs to be married somehow with some form of constituency system, so that the MP has a relationship with the constituency and therefore has a sort of power base independent from that purely of party bosses. Would that be a fair summary of the gist of the argument?
It would be. I think the issue, the issues that arise here is firstly that the Constitution requires that the results of an election must in general result in proportionality to give effect to the wishes of the electorate. So a simple constituency model with a first-past-the-post system, the Westminster model, if you like, would fall foul of that constitutional requirement of proportionality. But within that, there are various other options that are available, including the one that was recommended by the Van Zyl-Slabbert task team in 2002, which was multi-member constituencies, using a closed party list system, but a multi-member constituency in which proportional representation is applied rather than first past the post. And the view of the Van Zyl-Slabbert majority report was that in time one should move towards an open list system where the voters get to rank the candidates individually and therefore are able to make a closer preference for the people that they would like to see in Parliament. Having said that, I think experience from elsewhere in the world tells us that simply changing the electoral system does not deliver accountability and does not in any sense necessarily reduce the power of political parties over their MPs, whether they are in a defined single-member constituency or a multi-member constituency, because the reality is that political parties are a central feature of our democracy and many other democracies around the world. And, so that it's a mechanism to enhance accountability, but it's what I would say is it's a necessary step to take, but in itself, it's not sufficient to necessarily enhance levels of accountability.
Well, that's just the point I wanted to come to, because what I think your report says and what you've said to me in the past is that it is necessary, albeit not sufficient. That you think it's something whose time has come, albeit it's not a panacea. And I don't think anybody is arguing with the proposition that it's not a panacea and that's not going to sort out all the problems. But what I would like to focus on is why you think it is a necessary reform if we are going to enhance accountability.
Well, again, this is an area where CASAC has done some work, and we published a paper also in 2015, I think, that was prepared and written by Professor Stephen Friedman that looked at the issue of alternative electoral models and the impact on accountability. And the view is that whatever the electoral system we choose, there needs to be a change in political culture of holding political parties and individual representatives to account. And experience in South Africa tells us, and I've made reference to the electoral model that operates at a local government level, where we have constituencies, where we have single-member wards with a single councillor allocated to that. And it's clear that at a local government level that hasn't had an impact in terms of enhancing accountability, which is why that we say that it is not a sufficient mechanism on its own. But I think the broader issue about why it's necessary to revisit the electoral system, and CASAC doesn't have a particular preference for a particular model that we need to adopt. We believe that a national debate on the issue is necessary to identify the model most appropriate for democracy as it now exists in the 27 years after freedom. We understand the necessity at the time of having a simple closed party list PR system in 1994, but we think that experience has told us that this electoral model, and I think it's demonstrated by the issue we're discussing today, the role of Parliament, how it has served as an inhibitor towards the execution of responsibilities by members of Parliament who feel beholden to the party that has nominated them to Parliament. It in many cases would mean for a member of Parliament who chooses to step out of line, being disciplined by that political party, facing expulsion from the party and therefore a loss of income and livelihood. So these are serious issues that inhibit the members of Parliament using their own discretion to decide what is in the best interest of the country, how to execute their constitutional and legal mandates to the electorate and to serve the interests of the electorate rather than of the party officials that have placed them in those positions.
Now, in the course of your observations in the last few minutes, you've said that electoral reform would be advisable, but I think you have said that political culture is at the heart of the problem. And perhaps if you could just elaborate on your concerns about political culture insofar as it's relevant to this issue that the Commission is seized with, which is oversight in relation to allegations of state capture and corruption.
Well, I think, in our Constitution, we speak of an inclusive and a participatory democracy, and the Constitution makes adequate provision for that participatory democracy in terms of Parliament, that its processes must be open to the public and to the media. There must be public consultation on legislation and other policy development issues. And so the democracy we have is not simply one where a voter goes to a polling booth once every 5 years and makes a cross on a ballot paper, but is being more engaged in the politics and in what is happening and ensuring ultimately that those members who are elected to legislatures do what they promised in their manifestos, which is to increase the level of service delivery to people, to ensure that more services are available, to ensure that we have a thriving, prosperous economy in which people have jobs, don't suffer in poverty, and so on. And people have a right to that expectation, but people have a responsibility that when political parties and individual representatives are seen to be acting against that interest, they raise their voices and do so. And so it then becomes a two-way street that political parties will only become responsive when we demand that of them. And therefore, I place the responsibility on the electorate as well as on political parties who need to change the culture in which they operate in institutions of Parliament to see it as a deliberative forum where you don't just shut down debate, but you engage in debate and reach a decision after debate, and being open to persuasion, to compromise, and the like, which is a feature of a robust democracy.
Now, I take your point about the important role of the electorate and the electorate being, as it were, demanding and vigilant. But if we can focus for the moment on political parties themselves, and in the nature of a democracy in which whichever party wins a majority, it has great power over the actual decisions of the Parliament. Do you wish to comment at all on the question of political culture within political parties, and particularly the majority political party, as a factor of relevance to the issue that we are currently debating?
Well, I think we've seen an entrenchment of a culture of following the party line. And I don't think this is an issue that is unique to the majority or the ruling party. I think we see it in a number of the larger parties, that there is a consensus of opinion and an opinion that deviates from that is marginalized and is not given proper consideration. So, this speaks to an issue of internal party democracy and internal party tolerance of the differences of opinion. And where those differences of opinion are raised in order to enhance the ability of the party to discharge its manifesto's mandate, as well as its constitutional mandate in terms of, for example, issues in the Bill of Rights of enhancing and the delivery of rights in the Bill of Rights to the people of South Africa, then that's something that ought to be welcome. But we see culture, as I say, across political parties, where a party line is taken and no deviation from that or no debate on that is permitted. And I think that's the culture that is stifling to the development of our democracy and to the development of policies that can really begin to address the fundamental challenges that we face.
Now, can I refer you to paragraph 62 of your report, please? That's at page 227.
Did you say 62?
Paragraph 62 at page 227. Now, this is an extract from a judgment by Justice Jafta in the Constitutional Court in one of the various decisions that you referred to. But it's an extract that you used through your report to highlight a theme. And you quote Justice Jafta as having held the following: "The fact that members of the Assembly assume office through nomination by political parties ought to have a limited influence on how they exercise the institutional power of the Assembly. Where the interests of the political parties are inconsistent with the Assembly's objectives, members must exercise the Assembly's power for the achievement of the Assembly's objectives. For example, members may not frustrate the realization of ensuring a government by the people if its attainment would harm their political party. If they were to do so, they would be using the institutional power of the Assembly for a purpose other than the one for which the power was conferred. This would be inconsistent with the Constitution." Now, it seems to me that bears directly on what you were just talking about a moment ago, the problem of the situation in which there can emerge a conflict, or at least a perceived conflict, between the interests in relation to a particular issue of a political party and the constitutional duties of members of Parliament. Do you agree, and would you elaborate?
Indeed, I think this excerpt of this dicta from Justice Jafta has said more eloquently what I was trying to explain a moment ago. And I think it deals with that very issue of what is the ultimate responsibility of a member of Parliament. Yes, they hold their seats by virtue of the political party putting them on a list and having them nominated and then formally elected. But once they are nominated to Parliament, they take an oath of office, which is again prescribed in the Constitution. And it's an oath of office to uphold the law and to do what is in the interests of the country and not the political party. They don't take an oath of office to the political party. They may do that within their own political party. But once you become a member of Parliament, that constitutional oath of office is what ought to guide and direct a member's behavior within that institution. And I think this excerpt from the judgment of Justice Jafta encapsulates what that actually means, is that where there is a conflict between what your political party asks you to do and what the Constitution asks you to do, then your constitutional responsibility overrides that of the political party. And that's why I say earlier that the current electoral system is a great inhibitor on members of Parliament demonstrating that level of independence?
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Freund. I'm sorry, Mr. Freund. Well, Mr. Naidoo, the point of the conflict between what the party may view as in its interests, which its members which it may expect its members of parliament to protect and advance, and what may be in the interests of the Republic is quite an important issue. And there may be cases where maybe it's quite clear where the interests of the Republic lie. And if the party has a different view, it's a situation that could be seen as protecting people that may be involved in wrongdoing and so on. But I imagine that within the context of South Africa, because while at a certain level we can talk in general principles, we have also to talk in terms of the specific context of South Africa, where there has been one majority party in parliament, in the national parliament from 1994. It may be quite difficult for a member of the ruling party who wants to do the right thing if he or she is told, if you do this, what he or she regards as the right thing, you are going to cause disunity in the party, or he or she is being accused of being factional, or he or she is being accused or will be accused of not showing loyalty to the party, or he or she will be accused of forgetting that it's the party that brought her or him to parliament, or he or she will be accused of wanting to do things that will decrease the number of voters for the party in the next election. Do you want this party not to be the majority party after next elections? That kind of talk. You must tell me if my understanding of your evidence is correct. It seems that where you refer to the need for the change of culture, that may be what you are talking about, to say we may change a lot of things, but if there is no change of the culture, and in this context, one can talk about the culture in a particular political party, there would still be serious difficulties in having proper oversight and accountability, the executive being held accountable by Parliament, including the majority party. Is my understanding of your evidence correct?
Perhaps let me clarify, Deputy Chief.
Yes, and put it in your own words if you want to.
I think when it comes to issues of...
And put it in your own words if you want to. Yeah.
I think when it comes to issues of policy, so political parties get elected on the basis of a manifesto that they offer to the electorate. And so I'm not suggesting that we should do away with internal party discipline, far from it. And it would be legitimate for a political party to say, well, this is the manifesto we put to the electorate, and this is the manifesto we're going to implement as the majority party. And if a member then disagrees with that manifesto position, then the party has every right to discipline that member and say, well, this is the basis on which we were elected. But when it comes to issues of unconstitutional conduct, of allegations of illegality, of corruption, of misuse of public funds, of maladministration, then surely the Member of Parliament has the right to speak out and not be constrained in those circumstances by party discipline and being told that you have to do this regardless of the consequences of what that might be, that we're ignoring issues of corruption, we're ignoring issues of the misuse of public funds. After all, Parliament is the primary organ that is entrusted with oversight over the expenditure of public funds. Parliament, after all, is the institution that allocates those funds to the executive and has the responsibility of oversight over those funds. So I think I would draw that kind of distinction, Chair, in looking at that issue. And one doesn't want to undermine, or the role of political parties and their ability to be able to discipline their members and to call them into line and to impose a whip on particular votes where it is consistent with democracy, with the manifesto, and so on.
Well, what you say is important, and I think it is in line with what some of the witnesses have said, for example, Professor Calland, I think. So it seems to me that what you say and part of what Professor Calland said includes this, that it may be necessary that we try and find a way that accommodates legitimate party discipline within the context of members of parliament of a particular political party, and the need for members of parliament to be able to deal effectively with certain specific and identifiable issues such as corruption. Now, obviously, no party is going to come before the Commission and say, we want to be able to tell our members in Parliament not to raise issues of corruption. No party is going to do that. But what people may do in public and what they may do in private sometimes are different things. So the question that arises for me is whether it's possible to identify a list of matters where maybe there could be consensus among all right-thinking people in South Africa, all political parties, to say, if members of Parliament, if it comes to these matters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, members of Parliament must be able to really do their job the way they believe the interests of South Africa dictate, or whether that's going to be too difficult to draw the line, because a member of Parliament might be saying, I'm raising issues of corruption against, for example, for argument's sake, the president. And then maybe the party says, no, you are joining the opposition to try and unseat the ruling party, the ANC, for example, for argument's sake. They are starting with the president. It's just a start. So, in brief, my question is whether it's possible to identify issues where we could all try and get consensus to say, members of parliament, if it's these types of matters, they should be able to deal with them, and no party should be trying to force them to toe a particular line. Or is it just wishful thinking to think that is possible?
Chair, I think it's a difficult question, but my response to that would be, I think we would be able to identify certain issues that fall into that category. I think trying to produce an exhaustive list might be near impossible and perhaps not necessary. But I tried in my earlier response to say, well, where it involves allegations of serious misconduct, of criminal conduct, of corruption, abuse of public resources, those are the kinds of issues. And I think, to take your example, if there is an allegation of corruption against the president, then surely it is in the interest of the party for that matter to be aired and resolved. And if the president is innocent, it will be found to be so. And then you move on. And rather than having, those allegations hanging over the person against whom they are made. So that is that I would argue is the responsibility of Parliament. Once it becomes aware, either from members of Parliament, from members of the public, civil society, or the media, that there is a responsibility to take those allegations seriously. And on some occasions, it may be quite clear that the allegation is simply being made for a political motive and there's really no substance behind it. And then you dispose of it quickly. But you've got to deal with the issue so that you restore public confidence that the matter has been attended to. And if there's no evidence, it's dismissed. And if there is evidence, then there must be consequences. But that, I think, is the responsibility of Parliament.
Of course, in the current electoral system that we have, and that's partly why the suggestion about some combination of the current system and electoral and the constituency system is being suggested. In the current system, if I am a member of the ANC and there is this issue about corruption, about the president of the country who is the president of the party, if I speak too much or too harshly in Parliament about this, I may be thinking, the leadership of the party they are the ones who have a say on who gets promoted in terms of career, who finally gets into the list of Parliament next time after elections. And I'm not going to be endearing myself to them very much if I speak too much. So that too is an inhibiting factor. But I think the point you are making is, and I think Professor Kallan may have made the same point too, is, the constituency system is not a panacea. It might make a contribution to the problems that we have, but there may be a way of trying to marry the two systems and see how that can work, but nobody should expect that anything that we come up with will solve all challenges that we have. And then maybe that's where the issue of the change of culture becomes important. And maybe on the part of a particular political party to say, we don't want to be associated with corruption, for example. We don't want to be associated with covering up corruption, and any member of Parliament who is part of our party should not do anything that the public will perceive as covering corruption. In our deeds and in what we say, we must be seen to be anti-corruption. So maybe until you have that kind of situation of culture, there will be challenges. But if we were to have that culture, things would be much more easier. But that might take quite some time.
Indeed, Chair, it would take some time, and that's why I said earlier that any change of the electoral system would be necessary, but not a sufficient change to try and develop that kind of culture. In the current context, a member of Parliament who goes against the party leadership will find that to be a very career-limiting move, and will soon find themselves removed. So, I think come back to the proposal that we reconsider sections 47(3)(c), that, within a new electoral system, one consideration could be that once a member is elected to a legislature, the seat belongs to that member until the next election rather than to the party. That would give that member the freedom to do what they believe is right, without the threat of expulsion and losing their livelihoods.
Thank you. Mr. Freund?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to try and take Mr. Naidoo very briefly through a few discrete separate points.
That's fine.
Firstly, Mr. Naidoo, you deal from page 240 through to 245 with the Corder report. And as you're aware, Professor Corder will be the next witness. And no doubt he can talk to his own report in some detail. But if you could just summarize your stance and the stance of your organization to the core arguments made in that report, and in particular, the desirability of legislative reform on the question of parliamentary oversight.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. Indeed, I will defer to the expertise of Professor Corder to come, but perhaps the reason we've raised this in our report is to go back to what we said at the beginning of our report, which is that there is no hindrance in the current rules of the National Assembly, in the current constitutional and legislative environment, for Parliament to do what is necessary. But there's a failure to do so, whether it's a failure of political will, political commitment, a product of the electoral system that we have, as we've just discussed. But it seems to us that something more is needed in order to ensure, in the short term, at least until this new culture is hopefully developed, that there is a compulsion on members of Parliament to exercise this oversight responsibility, and for that to have consequences. And it therefore is our view that some of the recommendations in the Corder report, including an Accountability Standards Act, may be necessary in order to ensure that Parliament does what the Constitution mandates it to do, and which the rules of the National Assembly allow it to do, but is not always done. So we would certainly support the recommendations of the Accountability Standards Act, and in particular, I think the recommendations that Professor Corder and his team make with regards to the role of Chapter 9 institutions. This again is a subject of some discussion over a long period of time, and in a similar manner to Francel Slabbert's report that we just discussed, there is a report commissioned by Parliament itself, an ad hoc committee under the chairmanship of the late Professor Kader Asmal, produced a report in 2007 on Chapter 9 institutions and how they can their efficiency and effectiveness can be enhanced. And I think that's an issue that is again for debate. It's a matter that's been sitting with Parliament for some years now, but no progress has been made. And I think of a piece of legislation and the establishment of a dedicated committee to receive and deal with reports from Chapter 9 institutions is necessary. We use the example of SCOPA, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, from whom you've heard already, that we have a dedicated committee to deal with reports from the Auditor General. But we don't have dedicated committees, they go to the Justice Committee or wherever. But the proposal that there be a Chapter 9 committee, as it were, in Parliament, to process these reports from the Human Rights Commission, the Gender Commission, hears of them. They never get discussed, debated. The recommendations are not considered or even implemented. So I think in those regards, Professor Corder's report, despite being over 20 years old, I think it still has relevance today, and the proposals are worthy of further consideration.
And then I'd like to move forward to page 247 of your report, where you have a section on appointments to key institutions. Now, again, there will be later evidence from Mr. Lewis of Corruption Watch on this issue. So I don't want to steal all his thunder. But just in broad overview, what is your organization's position on the importance of improving the manner in which appointments to key institutions are effected and the manner of improving parliamentary oversight in that regard?
I think one of the things we've learned from the knowledge that we now have about state capture, evidence that has been led before this commission, is how key institutions that are tasked with fighting corruption were weakened during the state capture years, with individuals being appointed to head those institutions, particularly those in the law enforcement sector, in order to deliberately weaken them and undermine their capacity to execute their mandates. So we support the proposals that are made by Corruption Watch and the Institute for Security Studies, that there should be greater transparency and openness in these processes of appointment to key institutions such as the NPA, SAPS, the Hawks, IPID, and others. And that it should be a parliamentary process rather than within the gift of the executive, because we've seen, as a result of the ability of the executive to make those appointments without reference to Parliament, people are appointed who ultimately end up serving the interests of the executive rather than the interests of the legislative mandate. So we propose that a more open, competitive, and transparent process be conducted by Parliament in full view of the public, so that if it is a properly open and transparent process, the public would have greater confidence in those individuals who are appointed to lead these institutions and know exactly what their capabilities, skills, and expertise are in relation to those issues. So we use the example, I think, of the process that was followed late in 2018 for the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, which deviated from the past, where although that power in terms of the Constitution and the law rests with the President to make an appointment, a President established a panel to advise him on that appointment, and that process was conducted in public. And I think that has enhanced the credibility of the appointee and the institution that she now leads.
Right. A point of relatively small detail you touch on in paragraph 119 of your report, page 249 of Bundle 3. There have been a number of persons who have expressed the opinion in this stream of evidence before the Commission that, having regard to the importance of the roles played by chairpersons of portfolio committees, consideration should be given, leaving aside the current exception of SCOPA, to providing for a more proportionate distribution of chairs. I see from your report that that's a view that CASAC supports. Is that correct?
Well, it's a view that we believe needs to be considered by Parliament. This is a venture to say a highly controversial issue to raise. But I think if we look at the context of the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves within a multi-party democracy, but with a dominant party, and to give or to instill greater public confidence in Parliament's ability to execute its mandate and to be seen as a properly multi-party body in which all voices are accommodated, Parliament perhaps should give consideration to this issue. It's not a point that I think we're making particularly strongly, but we're saying it is a matter of consideration. But on that point, there's an associated point that I would like to make, and this is about Presidium of Presiding Officers in Parliament. From the early days of this Parliament, of the Democratic Parliament, there was always a member of the opposition, one of the opposition parties, who served as part of that Presidium. In the days of the Government of National Unity, it was the role of the Deputy Speaker that came from an opposition party. Subsequent to that, other members of opposition parties were appointed as House chairs or chairs of committees or some such position. And in recent times, we see that all of the members of the Presidium are drawn from the majority party. And once again, this gives us this perception to the public that it is the majority party that is controlling everything in Parliament. And I think if there were to be some representation from opposition parties amongst that Presidium, it would give the semblance of a multi-party democracy in which the voices of the opposition members are equally respected. So I think that's a proposal that we would make more strongly than that of committee chairs per se.
Then I'd just like to deal, because you stress it so much in your report, the issue of a dedicated anti-corruption agency. Now, it seems to me this strays perhaps slightly from the current focus on parliamentary oversight, but you have prepared and submitted an updated, detailed report, and I'm not going to take you into the detail, on the need for a single dedicated anti-corruption agency. If you would just talk to that extremely briefly and in summary.
Certainly. I think this follows on from the question we just dealt with a few moments ago about the appointment of heads of key institutions, particularly institutions in the law enforcement arena. And this, I think, flows from that, is that what we've learned from recent experience with regards to state capture and corruption is that the institutions of state were easily captured and therefore prevented from carrying out their responsibilities. And we've argued for a very long time that what South Africa needs is a truly independent anti-corruption agency that is insulated from undue political influence, that is insulated from executive influence, doesn't report directly to the executive, and whose members have security of tenure, who have adequate resources to execute their mandate and report to Parliament. Now, these proposals have, I'm very pleased to say, finally received some consideration by government, as it is in the process of developing its national anti-corruption strategy. And as the President mentioned in his State of the Nation address last week, a National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council is soon to be established, which will be a transitional structure to see us towards some sort of independent anti-corruption agency. So I think progress has been made in that regard, but I think the important point to stress is that we cannot expect the institutions that have failed us in the recent past to succeed simply because there are new personnel at the head of those institutions for the moment. Those personnel could change in future, and the effectiveness of those institutions would then be similarly weakened. So we need to take this opportunity to strengthen the institutional capacity of anti-corruption agencies to execute their mandate without political interference and in the interests of the country at large. And we believe that the time for a dedicated anti-corruption agency has come, and we're certainly very pleased that it is something that government is now seriously considering.
And I think a point you made in passing was that ultimately would be accountable to Parliament rather than to the executive.
That is correct. It is a proposal that's been made in the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and for this body that it should not report directly to the executive, that its reporting to Parliament would enhance the transparency of that organisation, would enhance its levels of accountability to the institution of Parliament, and that it can then be held to account by Parliament in an open and transparent manner.
And finally, Mr. Naidoo, your report is fairly lengthy. I have cherry-picked what seemed to me to be some core points to highlight, but I want to give you a final opportunity to consider whether there's anything material that you would have wished to have had a chance to mention that you haven't had a chance to mention.
Well, firstly, thank you, Mr. Freund, for the opportunity to share our views on these matters. I think we've traversed the main recommendations that we've made in our report. It is a lengthy report, as you say, but I think the recommendations are succinctly put towards the end of that report, and I think we've adequately covered that. So unless there's anything you wish to probe further, I think I'm happy that we've covered the substance of the CASAC submission.
Well, thank you, Mr. Naidoo. I have no further questions, Chair.
Thank you. Well, one or two questions, Mr. Naidoo, with special reference to the notion of a dedicated anti-corruption agency. One of the matters that has been in my mind since I was appointed to chair this commission with regard to corruption has been whether, after we have made whatever findings we will make at the end of the work of the commission, whether we should look at certain things being changed with regard to how existing bodies that are meant to fight corruption operate. In other words, look at where the weaknesses are and recommend that they be strengthened so that they operate in a manner that will ensure an effective fight against corruption on their part, or whether one should look at making a recommendation about a new structure or a new body. And one of my concerns has been that coming up with another body that will be an anti-corruption body might be criticized on the basis that one is multiplying anti-corruption bodies when there are various bodies that are there to fight corruption, and one should be strengthening them rather. So there's been that issue that one has been thinking about. So the question that arises in relation to your proposal about a dedicated anti-corruption agency is whether the proposal envisages that some of the existing bodies that fight corruption in our country would be abolished, or they would all continue and this would be an additional body.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think that's an issue that we discuss in the broader paper that we've submitted as an annexure, and it's also formed part of the discussions towards the development of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. I think in brief, if I may respond, that the idea that we have a plethora of agencies at the moment that deal with or have either a constitutional or legal mandate to fight corruption. And that's perhaps one of the problems that we have, is that we have too many of those institutions. So I think the proposal in terms of a dedicated anti-corruption agency is that it becomes that a multi-agency approach is replaced with a multidisciplinary approach within an umbrella structure. So the existing capacity that we have, and we have significant capacity to combat corruption. There is capacity within the Special Investigating Unit. There is capacity that is being established at the moment within the Investigating Directorate at the NPA. There is capacity within the Hawks, the Financial Intelligence Center, and a range of other bodies. And it's how to harness those could be more effective. So it's about using the capacity that already exists, bringing it under the umbrella of an independent agency that is able to fight corruption more fearlessly and more effectively.
I take that answer to be saying, yes, some of the existing bodies that fight corruption would have to go, but the personnel in them, or at least some of them, that might be seen to be suitable to serve in this new body would need to be taken over, because the new body would need the experience and capacity that might come from those bodies. So is my interpretation correct of your evidence?
It is indeed, Chair, and if I can perhaps use an example to demonstrate that. So I think in this new body would not require the dissolution as a whole of the Hawks, as an example, because the Hawks have a broad mandate that includes corruption, but is about priority crimes, including organized crime and a range of other things. So I think in that context, one would remove the anti-corruption mandate for Hawks, leave the Hawks to deal with other issues, and move that anti-corruption mandate into the new body. With regards to an institution like the Special Investigating Unit, whose sole focus is corruption, but the constraint on the SIU is that they can only act on a presidential proclamation. So if the president doesn't issue a proclamation, they are unable to act. And so you move that capacity and disband the SIU effectively, because they have no other role to play, and move that in. So I think it depends on the institution that we're talking about. And perhaps, if I can just perhaps add one further point, Chair, it is envisaged that this new agency will not only be responsible for investigating corruption, but also a broader mandate, which we've seen from comparative studies in other countries, where issues of the preventative role that a body needs to play, as well as the very important public education role and mandate, would fall within the ambit of the structure. Currently, public education is largely left to civil society to deal with, to tell the public about corruption. And I'm sure Mr. Lewis will talk about that later on today. So it's giving that a mandate, broader mandate, because we need to have a much broader strategy of fighting corruption simply than rather just investigating and prosecuting, which has been the focus to date.
So part of what this body would do, in CASAC's view, would be to investigate corruption. And once it has investigated corruption, to then hand over the docket or the file, so to speak, to the NPA, or so it wouldn't have to go to SAPS. I would imagine the docket, if they have investigated, they should just hand over to the NPA, and the NPA does what it's supposed to do. So that, but as I understand it, that would not prevent the police from still investigating corruption. They could still investigate corruption, but this will just be a dedicated body that focuses on corruption without taking away any power from the police to investigate corruption. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct, Chair. And there would need to be working relationships developed between structures like that, like the SAPS, to be able to, at some point, refer matters to this body. If a complaint is laid with SAPS, to say this body is better equipped to investigate and deal with that. Similarly, for example, with the Office of the Public Protector, if a matter of corruption is a complaint is laid with the Public Protector, that office will be able to investigate that. But in certain circumstances, and the memoranda of agreement and so will need to be established, to be able to refer that to this agency and say you have more specialized knowledge and capacity to be able to deal with something like this. So I think, those sorts of relationships would need to be developed over time to be able to create an umbrella of bodies that can actually tackle the challenges that we face better than we've done in the past.
And I think you are also saying, which I think you said earlier on, in respect of some bodies, and you mentioned the SIU, in terms of this proposal, that body would need to come to an end, but its personnel, with the expertise that they have, could go to the new agency. But when it comes to certain bodies such as the Hawks, this proposal doesn't entail that the Hawks be abolished, because the Hawks don't just investigate corruption, they've got other crimes that they investigate. So they would continue. In that case, the body will not be abolished, but its mandate that relates to corruption might be taken away. But you say in terms of the general SAPS, that there would be no interference with their power to investigate corruption. In terms of the public protector, to the extent that the public protector also investigates corruption, that would not be interfered with. So is my understanding correct?
That is indeed correct, Chair.
Yes. No, thank you very much, Mr. Naidoo. We appreciate that you availed yourself to assist us. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. You are now excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Freund?
Chair, Professor Corder is ready, willing and able, but I see it's now almost 11:30. I would imagine you may wish to take the tea break, and we can resume as soon as you're willing to do so, ready to do so.
Yes, let's take the tea break and return at 11:45. We adjourn.
Good day, Prof. How are you? Prof, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks very much. I hope that you can see me clearly.
Yes, we just wanted to test the sound and see whether you can hear us from the hearing
Good.
venue.
I can hear you. I just hope you can hear me.
Okay, Tooms, is it better? Is it fine? Obiven, how's the sound there? Obiven, how's the sound of the witness? Continue talking, Prof, please.
Hello. Yes, I understand this is a sound check. I hope that you can hear me clearly.
Are you on a speaker, Prof? Are you using a speaker? Or are you speaking straight to the device?
No, I'm using a laptop.
Okay. Tumi, how's that? Can you just drop your volume a little bit from your device, Prof, please? A little bit.
Okay. Definitely.
That's better.
How is that? Is that better?
Can you continue talking, Prof? Testing 1, 2, sound check.
Yes.
Hearing venue.
Is that better in terms of volume?
It's much better. Secondly, I wanted to check, are you going to be taking oath of affirmation, Prof?
I'll take the oath.
Thank you so kindly.
Thank you.
Last check from the hearing venue. Prof, what are you there? Last check from the hearing venue. Professor, what are you there? Morning, Prof, are you there? We're about to start. Good morning, Professor Howard, are you there?
Yes, I am. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. We're about to start. Thank you so kindly.
Thank you.
SC, are you ready?
I'm ready, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Freund.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, the next witness is Professor Hugh Corder, who is with us. His evidence is intended to be admitted as Exhibit ZZ11 in Bundle 3 from page 270 and following.
Yes, Professor Corder, are you there?
Yes, Chair, good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Professor Corder. Thank you very much for availing yourself to come and assist the Commission. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. The registrar will administer an oath or affirmation to you, depending which one you prefer. She will administer the oath or affirmation right now.
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
Hugh Micah Corder.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
I do.
Do you solemnly swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you very much. Mr. Freund, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Corder, is it correct that you have prepared and submitted to the Commission an affidavit which is to be found in Bundle 3, commencing at page 270?
That is correct.
And that your signature appears at page 295, confirming that that is your affidavit?
That is correct.
And what you deal with in your affidavit is fundamentally a report that you had previously prepared at the request of the original Speaker of the Democratic Parliament, Ms. Franny Jinwala. Is that correct?
That's right. Dr. Jinwala was the Speaker.
And in paragraph 6.2.3 of your affidavit, which is at page 273, you refer to your report. But you make the point that because that report had already been submitted to the Commission, you're not annexing it again as an annexure to your affidavit.
That is correct.
And your report, just for reference purposes, is in the reference bundle at pages 49 to 84. And I think you have access to that if need be. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Chair, in the light of that evidence, may I move formally that the affidavit of Professor Corder with annexures be introduced as Exhibit ZZ11.
The affidavit of Professor Hugh Micah Corder, starting at page 270, is together with its annexures admitted as Exhibit ZZ11.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Corder, if I could take you to paragraph 4 of your affidavit. You deal there with the fact that you're an emeritus professor of public law, and you attach your curriculum vitae. That's actually at page 296. I don't think there's any need for you to turn to that, but perhaps what you could do is just to give the chair a very brief thumbnail sketch of your expertise and qualifications, because you do testify, as it were, in a capacity as an expert in this field.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. I'll keep it brief, Chair, and happily answer any additional questions you may have. I studied my LLB degree at the University of Cape Town. I did what is effectively a master's degree at Cambridge, and then my doctoral thesis at Oxford in the years 1979 to 1982 looked at the role of the appellate division, as it then was, from 1910 to 1950 in South Africa, looking at the role of the judiciary in imposing unjust laws. I returned to South Africa and commenced my academic career at the University of Stellenbosch, but was appointed to the chair of public law at the University of Cape Town in mid-1987. I think that the most important point to stress from the balance of my CV is not what I've done at the University of Cape Town, but my membership of the technical committee, which drafted the first Bill of Rights for South Africa at the Kempton Park negotiations in 1993, which has informed some of my views in the so-called Corder report. And I need to acknowledge the assistance 22 years ago of Ms. Saras Jagwanth and Mr. Fred Salter. But that also led to Dr. Jinwala requesting me to do the 3 research projects, the third one of which resulted in the Corder report, which are referred on page 2, paragraph 5, paragraph 5, yes, of my affidavit, which I believe is on page 271 of the bundle.
That's correct. And as you explain in that portion of your affidavit, you were actually asked to do 3 separate investigations and reports, only one of which is of direct relevance for present purposes. And that was the one in relation to parliamentary oversight.
That's correct.
So if you could perhaps, it's actually in paragraph 6.2 that you deal with that. And if you could perhaps, if I take you to page 273, numbered page 4 of the original affidavit, you indicate, as it were, the terms of reference of relevance. If I take you to paragraph 7.1, I'm just going to highlight a couple that seem to me to be of most direct relevance, that you were asked by the Speaker on behalf of Parliament to outline and explain the nature of the obligation that section 55(2) of the Constitution places on the National Assembly, that's the oversight provision. And in point 5, what mechanisms and procedures should be put in place to achieve the fulfillment of the constitutional obligation of parliamentary oversight of the executive. Those are the core presently relevant parts of the mandate that led to you and your team producing the report, which we've come to know as the Corder report. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you tell the chair in paragraph 7.2 of your affidavit that after a process of an interim report and engagement, you ultimately submitted a final report to the then Speaker by July of 1999. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in your affidavit, you've extracted, for convenience, the executive summary of the report, and even that executive summary I don't propose for present purposes to read into the record. It speaks for itself. But it seems to me that if we go to the foot of page 274, you dive in straight into the difficult issue, and that is accountability and oversight and what they mean. And perhaps if you'd like to either read into the record or talk to, as it were, your then executive summary of your views on the essence of the meaning of accountability and the duty of oversight in the context that we're presently interested in.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. I think I would like to sketch very briefly some context to this report. We all know, and the Constitutional Court through Justice Mohammed said it very clearly, and indeed what is known as the post-amble to the interim constitution made the point that the current constitutional dispensation, number one, is a ringing and decisive break from the past. We all know the extent to which the apartheid executive had come to dominate Parliament and effectively to create it as really as a lapdog to question the executive. That's the first point I want to make. So there was a determination in the constitutional making process to ensure that the new constitutional dispensation would not fall foul or not run the risk of becoming a lapdog parliament. The second broad point is the values which are contained in Section 1 of the Constitution. If we have any section of the Constitution that is more special than any other, it is Section 1, because only a 75% majority of the National Assembly can change any aspect of that section. And I want to refer particularly to the values in 1C, of the rule of law and the supremacy of the Constitution, and the values in 1D, which essentially constitutionalize the notion of a participative democracy. And within that, the last three words are particularly important to me, and I have stressed them throughout my teaching in the area of administrative law. This is about accountability, responsiveness, and openness. And at that point, I think it would be appropriate to talk about the definition of accountability. Section 55(2) requires, there's the word must there. Parliament can't get away from it. It's got to oversee the actions of the executive. And I would say that there are three elements to accountability and oversight. Number one, the executive has to explain what, if Parliament asks it to do so, the executive has to explain, to clarify its actions and its decisions. Secondly, under the understanding of the doctrine of the separation of powers as being mutual respect between the three branches of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And it's mutual respect. It's not only one respecting the other. It is each must respect each other's proper domain. Secondly, the executive must justify its actions to a certain extent. Thirdly, and this is the most, I would suggest, controversial and difficult to demarcate, I would argue that there is an aspect of accountability, and I'm relying on some of the literature that was around already in the 1990s in this respect. The executive should amend, there's what is referred to as amendatory accountability. The executive must explain, must justify, and I suppose one could say in a mutually respectful relationship, negotiate with Parliament, or at least the majority in Parliament as far as is necessary, the amending of any action or policy, action taken or policy decided upon. Perhaps I'll stop at that point so I don't go too long.
That's a convenient point, because now if we can focus on the actual wording of what you said at the time, which is the point I was taking to at the foot of page 274, you say in your report, in your executive summary of your report in 1999, basically accountability means to give an account of actions or policies, or to account for spending and so forth. And then you've emphasized accountability can be said to require a person to explain and justify against criteria of some kind their decisions or actions. It also requires that the person goes on to make amends for any fault or error and take steps to prevent its recurrence in the future. And as you have already said, it's really that particular sentence, that last feature, which causes the greatest difficulty. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, you are.
But notwithstanding its difficulty, you stand by the notion, this has been referred to as amendatory accountability, you stand by the notion that the accountability which is owed by the executive to the legislature includes, obviously not limited to, but includes an obligation to make amends for fault or error and to take steps to prevent, and it empowers Parliament to take steps to prevent recurrences in the future. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think I would emphasize those two words, fault or error. It's not necessarily that one policy is preferred above another, or that one decision was made where a contrary decision could have been taken. It is that the policy itself, the determination of the policy, or the decision itself is shown in the process of explanation and justification to have been based on fault or error. So it's quite a high standard that is set there. And the reason for that is because it's not the proper domain of Parliament to deter, under separation of powers, to determine policy or to make executive decision on a day-to-day basis.
Now, you make the point that I'm reading at the foot of page 275. We are of the view that section 55(2)(a) sets the obligatory minimum standards of accountability for executive organs of state in the national sphere of government. The National Assembly must set up mechanisms to hold them accountable. And then you go on in your report to recommend 3 types of legislative intervention. And you start to address that at the foot of page 276 of your affidavit, under the heading Revising Present Arrangements. And you say this: in the light of Parliament's constitutional obligations and present practices, the legislation we propose would provide for a mandatory accountability, brackets, which requires that where deficiencies have been uncovered, they be corrected.
Wrongs should be redressed, yes.
And wrongs be redressed. And then close brackets, and prescribe standards, content and format for reporting. And then you go on to deal in some detail with the procedure on receipt of reports and so forth. So perhaps the starting point for an understanding of your report is an understanding of your core recommendation as to legislative reform, and why at that time you thought legislative reform was appropriate.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Freund. The Deputy Chief Justice would know that at the time we were working on the report, 1999, late 98 and early 99, 2 other statutes were in the process of being drafted. Already on the statute books was the the Promotion of Equality and the Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, PEPUDA, as it is commonly known, which gave greater flesh to the skeleton of the right to equality in Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. But in 98, 99, the immediate context, and I was involved in one of those 2 legislative reform or law reform processes, saw the drafting of 2 acts of Parliament: the Promotion of Access to Information Act, in support of the right of access to information in Section 32 of the Constitution, and the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, the PAJA, which was in support of Section 33 in the Constitution, the rights to administrative justice. Now, the idea behind that is that the Constitution provides a skeletal right, so to speak, but that further flesh needed to be added to the skeleton. And although there was a direct constitutional injunction in the final Constitution of 1996 to draft the PEPUDA, the PAJA and the PAIA, and although there was none in relation to Section 55(2) oversight responsibilities, it seemed to me, to us, wise and appropriate that we should propose the drafting and adoption of legislation in the form of 2 acts of Parliament, which we are included both in the Quarter Report and in my affidavit. Firstly, the Accountability Standards Act, and secondly, the Accountability and Independence of Constitutional Institutions Act. I won't at this point expand on the necessity for either, but I think that I won't say anything more about that at this point, unless Mr. Fink wishes me to do so.
Let's come back to that. In a nutshell, you proposed the adoption of legislation for reasons that are set out both in the report and in the affidavit. You furnished your report, and before we come back to your report and to its current relevance, if any, it's just helpful if we can just put it in its proper historical context. You furnished your report And so far as you were aware, what came of your report? To what extent was it taken up? To what extent were you engaged on the point? And what has been your subsequent involvement, if any?
Thank you, Mr. Freund. I would refer to paragraph 8 on page 278 of the bundle. And I set out there the detail of what happened. One of the critical elements is that the second democratic election took place just before the submission of the report. And whereas the Joint Rules Committee, as far as I can recall, under the first Parliament, was our interlocutor, so to speak, because we reported to the Speaker, but we then engaged, or I then engaged, with the Joint Rules Committee. The membership of that committee and the core of MPs in Parliament had changed substantially between the first and the second Parliament. And one of the, when I appeared before the committee, one of the complaints, so to speak, was that there had been insufficient consultation with the members. And that was clearly so, because many of the members with whom consultation had taken place, because an interim report had been submitted in March of 1999, many of those MPs were no longer in Parliament. As far that really was the end of my direct engagement with Parliament, but I followed it really at a distance. And as I say in paragraph 8.1.2, to my knowledge, a subcommittee of the Rules Committee, or indeed perhaps of the Justice Committee, chaired by Ms. Fatima Chauhan, MP, considered the report and then reported further to either the Joint Rules Committee or the Justice Committee. I was no longer, from that moment onwards, no longer directly involved at any stage in the intervening 20 years, Chair.
And you've made the point to me, Professor Corder, that as regards the, as it were, developments on the ground in Parliament in the succeeding period, you defer to the greater personal knowledge, for example, of Richard Calland and even our last witness, Lawson Naidoo. You think that really the chair should look to them to consider, as it were, what happens subsequent to your report. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Freund, for bringing up that point. That is exactly so. Indeed, Chair, I might say that when first approached to give evidence, to submit an affidavit, I had no typed copy of the recorder report, and the only way that I could get hold of it was provided by Mr. Freund, who in turn I think got it from the Parliamentary Monitoring Group or some other group. I had not in any way abandoned a general observation of this notion, because it is integral to administrative law as well and administrative justice, which is my staple diet. But I haven't had any further direct engagement, nor had I made a direct study or research of what had happened on oversight and accountability.
And you are not particularly, you've had a look for purposes of this evidence at the rules of the National Assembly, but you're not particularly conversant or expert in those rules.
No.
But what you can say, I think with some confidence, is that the recommended legislation that you proposed was not adopted.
That is correct.
And in preparation for giving your evidence today, you've been asked to consider to what extent, if any, you stand by the view that legislation of the type that you proposed now more than 20 years ago will be of value. And I think it's fair to say that your core view is you still think it would be of value. Is that correct?
Absolutely so.
So really, I think what we want to focus on now for the duration of the rest of your evidence is really to substantiate that, to look at why you thought legislation was a good idea, and why, notwithstanding everything that's happened since then, you remain of the view that Parliament should be encouraged to re-look at the question of whether it supports and would be minded to adopt legislation of the type that you recommended some 20 years ago. So why don't I leave it to you to, as it were, talk to that in overview, and then we can go to some more detailed issues in due course.
Thank you. I think in overview, as a matter of constitutional doctrine and as a matter of principle, I would refer again to the word must in section 55(2). That is an imperative, that is a command, if you like, to Parliament to provide for mechanisms for oversight.
Well, I interrupt you there, Professor Porter, just to read into the record, because not everybody would be familiar with the wording. What section 55(2) of the Constitution says is the following. The National Assembly must provide for mechanisms, A, to ensure that all executive organs of state in the national sphere of government are accountable to it. That's really the clause to which you're talking, am I correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
Now, a broad overview of the manner in which Parliament has carried out its oversight role would disclose the following, I believe, and I believe this would withstand any form of analysis or research or interrogation. Chair, one of the roles that I played very early on in our democratic era was to be an advisor to the theme committee, the portfolio committee on health in Parliament. It was chaired at that point by Dr. Chabalala Msimang, and the chair may well recall the Sarafina 2 incident early on, where the then Minister of Health, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, asked Mbongeni Ngema to produce the Sarafina 2 as an AIDS awareness tool. And that was done at considerable cost to the fiscus, and it was done apparently, or at least there were questions about the regularity on the tender process there. I only mention this because it is an incident. The Health Committee then summoned the Minister, please, to come and explain why she had done so. So that was to explain and to a certain extent to justify. In the end, the summons was withdrawn for reasons that I do not know. But I would guess that it could be fairly said that the first Parliament exercised its oversight role vigorously in the true spirit in which Section 55(2) had been adopted. Things went a bit quiet after 2009, after 1999, pardon me. After 1999, after the first Parliament, there was quite a revival in 2008, 2009, under the presidency of President Motlanthe. Parliament crept back inside its shell from the time of Mr. Zuma's ascendance to the presidency. I think there would be very few, in this respect, the oversight role, very few people who would question the broad analysis that I have given. Secondly...
hang on one second, Professor Hugo, I might have missed this.
Yes.
I heard clearly that you made the point that during the term of the first democratic parliament, there was vigorous performance by Parliament of its role, oversight role. That, of course, would have been from 94 to 99. I thought you were going to talk about the second parliament, but I seem to have understood you to jump to 2007 and so on. Did I hear correctly? Were you suggesting that until around 2007, a parliament had performed its oversight role vigorously?
Pardon me, Chair, I apologize for that, for the confusion I have created. I would argue that in fact Parliament crept back inside its shell from about 2000 onwards during the first and incomplete second terms of President Mbeki, that it found its voice again during the presidency of President Motlanthe, but then it went quiet again from President Zuma's accession to power onwards. And I think that the way that I have explained it to myself and heard others explain it relates to the point that has been made by both Professor Calland and Mr. Naidoo and others. It comes back to the electoral system, the party dominance of one majority party throughout the life of our democratic constitutional South Africa, and it goes to the political culture which has dominated within, I don't know. I'm not a party politician, Chair, but I would say both within the majority party and, frankly, perhaps some of the opposition parties as well. So I'm not only pointing fingers in one direction, but that is speculation. And it seems to me, and to coming back to answering the point that the question that Mr. Freund asked me, why is it relevant now again, 20 years on, to have those two statutes at least, or something like it, like them? And I think that you could, through a process of research and negotiation with Parliament, draft statutes which encourage members of Parliament to fulfill their constitutional duties, to fulfill the duties imposed on them by their oath of office, and to exercise the kind of oversight role by the legislature, which incidentally is played by almost every legislature in other constitutions in the world. I did a quick survey again in the previous week or so, Chair. There is almost no constitution which does not require the legislature to oversee and to hold accountable the executive. And it is, and I would just add one more thing, Chair, that if the Parliament, if one of the three branches of government does not play its assigned constitutional role according to the Constitution, then there's a vacuum. And another branch of government has to step into the breach. And I would argue, and I've written on this, that in the last 9 to 10 years in particular, the courts, and led by the Constitutional Court, have been placed in some ways unfairly in the firing line, politically and in public discourse, because Parliament failed. So for me, the failure of Parliament is shown by the extent to which broadly political questions, not necessarily party political questions, but broadly political and constitutional questions have been thrown to the judiciary. And the judiciary, in my own view, has stepped up to the plate magnificently, but there is a danger because the judiciary is exposed to party political attack, and that leads to, and it may lead, and sometimes does, to an inclination on behalf of the executive to want to undermine the judiciary. I'll stop at that point, on that point, because I don't want to go on into a long discussion about lawfare unless the chair wants me to, or unless Mr. Freund wants me to. But I think it's a direct consequence of the failure of Parliament to do its job of oversight, and that in turn, as my colleague Calland and Mr. Naidoo have explained, relates directly to the electoral system, the party whip, political culture. So whatever legislation we have will have to address, to some extent, without undermining the party whip, will have to address the political culture and persuade MPs of every political party to do what is required of them under the Constitution. Perhaps I should stop there. I've been going on too long already.
Professor Corder, you've correctly drawn attention to the three arms: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And you touched on the implications for the judiciary when the legislature fails to do what it should do. But I don't know whether you heard the evidence or saw reports on the evidence of the very first witness to testify in this stream of evidence, Mr. Themba Gordy, who had a slightly different view on the root of the problem. His view, with focus on the reports received by SCOPA from the Auditor General, the reports issued by SCOPA, endorsed by the National Assembly, his view was that the fundamental problem was a failure of the executive to respond appropriately to the reports and recommendations of the legislature. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that, because I think it connects with this issue that you have touched on already, but which we're going to need to deal with in further detail, on the issue of the amendatory feature of accountability of the executive to the legislature.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. There are several questions in that one question. Firstly, I'm afraid that I only read reports of Mr. Gordy's evidence, but it is significant. He chairs SCOPA, and SCOPA is the only parliamentary committee which has a chair who is not drawn from the majority party. Now, one of the recommendations, or at least suggestions I make in my affidavit, and perhaps I can find it, it's in paragraph 9 onwards on page 279. One of the recommendations I make there is that it is perfectly possible for Parliament to distribute the chairing role of the many portfolio and joint standing committees among different political parties. Frankly, the role of a chair should be a neutral arbiter and manager of the proceedings of a committee. And it's akin to the role of a speaker in Parliament, in the National Assembly. And I would propose, as I have, that is one reform that might come within the rules of Parliament. That doesn't require legislation. It occurs to me too that the notion of a rotating chairpersonship of committees could be adopted in Parliament. Parliament sits for 5 years. The term of Parliament is 5 years. And it could be that every 18 months or so, the chairpersonship of a committee rotates. Now, the critical, the nub of the question that you asked me is to put to me the argument of Mr. Gordy that SCOPA did its work that it asked the executive to explain, to justify, and perhaps even to amend from time to time. And that response came there none from the executive. It seems to me that the answer to that lies in, let me first say, it seems to me that one could explore statutory means to bolster the obligation under Section 55(2) in the Constitution, in a sense to force the executive to do such explaining, justification, and, where appropriate, amending. But there's a non-law and political explanation for the failure by the executive, and that could be, and I do not know, so I'm speculating here, that the vast majority of opinion among members of parliament of the dominant party, or let us say the political culture which has recently been described in an opinion piece by the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC of democratic centralism, led to those members of parliament who wished for a degree of accountability, led to their being handicapped in pushing for that kind of response from the executive. I do not know. I'm not inside the caucus. But from outside, it seems to me that is the kind, and from other evidence of which I've read reports, that is the kind of atmosphere that might have prevailed within the caucus of the majority party.
Now, Professor Corder, we clearly don't have time to deal in detail with your proposed Accountability Standards Act, but you deal with that at pages 281 through to 290 of your affidavit. And perhaps you could just try to highlight for the chair, as it were, the main 2 or 3 points, if it comes to that, that you think you haven't as yet made, but that you feel should be drawn out to emphasize the points you're trying to make there.
Thank you. So the detail there refers to prescribed minimum standards of accountability, of administrative accountability, and that could be expanded to executive accountability. That's one area which would need attention. I think a second area that might still need attention.
I'm sorry, Professor Chief. I missed that first point. Would you please just repeat it?
Yes, certainly, Chair. There is a reference on, sorry, Chair, I just saw it a moment ago, on page, pardon me, page 283 of the bundle, to prescribed minimum standards of administrative accountability. In other words, saying to the public service and public servants that this is what we expect of you in order to help us hold the executive accountable to standards. And similar standards could be prescribed for the executive as well. But the point that I was about to make also as an additional point is that an enormous number of bodies must report to Parliament. This is the pattern all over the world. Administrative and executive bodies must report to the Supreme Legislature. Parliament, what we proposed 20 years ago is that Parliament should develop a sophisticated and a nuanced system of receipt of report, tracking of reports, because typically the reports are routed to portfolio committees for consideration, and then keeping a track of what happens subsequently. So it's a matter of, I suppose, audit and record keeping. And we proposed as part of the Accountability Standards Act that a central reporting office be established in Parliament for the receipt and the tracking of reports to make sure that the portfolio committees didn't just look at the report or even less than that, receive the report and not engage with it in any other way. We also proposed a type of financial oversight as a complement to the PFMA and the Municipal Finance Management Act, but more so the PFMA. And that might not be necessary at this point, given the fact that the PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act, has been in place for so long, and perhaps that is working well, but that was part of what we proposed. One more point, and I'm referring now to page 286 of the bundle, Chair, and forgive me if I'm going too quickly, but we proposed, and this has been achieved to some extent, but I believe not sufficiently well yet, that the existing parliamentary research capacity to assist portfolio committees in their accountability and oversight function ought to be expanded. I'm afraid we used the word beefing up in those days. And we also proposed a specific standing committee in regard to the Auditor General, and that has, as we know, been established. So I think I have to say, because I haven't said it expressly, that Parliament has, to some extent, done, whether in response to these recommendations or not, has made changes. I don't know whether Mr. Freund would like me, or Chair, you would like me, to talk to the specific establishment of a portfolio committee or a standing committee to deal with the Chapter 9 institutions and other constitutional institutions. But that was very much part of our proposal at that point, because the Chapter 9 institutions, which I would just make this point, Chair, were foreseen, the necessity of the Chapter 9 institutions were foreseen already in our work at the Technical Committee for Fundamental Human Rights in Kempton Park in 1993, because the Human Rights Commission and the Public Protector's Office were established from the 27th of April, 1994. We had a massive democratic deficit at the end of apartheid. And we recognized, and the multi-party negotiating process recognized, that we needed other bodies, in addition to Parliament, to bolster the achievement or to facilitate the achievement of our constitutional democratic values. And it's in terms of the relationship between those constitutional institutions and Parliament, to whom they report, that we felt some kind of specific standing committee ought to be proposed. So those were the kind of issues that we envisaged at that stage would need to be contained in the Accountability Standards Act. What would have to be done, if such an act is contemplated today in 2021, would be a detailed audit of what Parliament has done so far in the intervening couple of decades, and to identify the gaps. And I would suggest that parliamentarians should be able to make their inputs in this regard in order to take their oversight role seriously. I'll stop at that point, Chair.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, you have run a little ahead of where I intended to be, but since you have, let's focus on what you're dealing with, and that's the question of the Chapter 9 institutions. And I would have in mind not only the Auditor General, but in particular the Public Protector, amongst others. And a number of people, a number of politicians have expressed the view to me, and I think some of them have testified before the Commission, that it's really not the job of Parliament to investigate allegations of malfeasance. That's for the Chapter 9 institutions. And once the Chapter 9 institutions have done their job, it's really not for Parliament to do anything about it. Now, what you talk to in your report is, as it were, a partnership, a relationship between the Chapter 9 institutions and Parliament, each having their respective roles, but nonetheless being mutually reinforcing. And you propose in your proposed legislation that this be sort of clarified and defined. Would you perhaps just talk to that and correct me if I put it incorrectly?
Chair, thank you. That is exactly correct. So the proposal is for an accountability, and because the Chapter 9 institutions, like any other institution under the rule of law and our constitutional democracy, need to be able to account for their activities. So, and to whom do they account? They account to Parliament. So they report to Parliament annually, at least they ought to. They get their budget through Parliament. And if a public protector or members of the Human Rights or a commission or the Commission on Gender Equality or so on, all of the Chapter 9 institutions, if a member needs to be appointed, Parliament does that work. So it is quite correct. They were seen in their conception in 1993 as being complementary, working together with Parliament while retaining an independent role. And that is why we proposed the accountability and independence. And you'll note that we didn't refer to the Chapter 9 institutions, and the title of that chapter is State Institutions Assisting Constitutional Democracy. We referred to constitutional institutions because there are some similar bodies which are not included in the list of Chapter 9 institutions, which play important roles to help in the constitutional, the realization of the constitutional dream, so to speak. And so a strong and respectful working relationship between those bodies we saw, and I would argue, is part of the constitutional design even today.
So let me take you to a specific example, because we've heard specific evidence, and you may not have heard this evidence, but there has been specific evidence in this work stream on the problems at PRASA. And there has been specific evidence, on the one hand, of real concern and expressed by the Auditor General's Office about serious and rapidly worsening irregular expenditure. In relation to the same entity, there has been evidence about the report by the Public Protector, Derailed, which focused on alleged corruption and malfeasance in procurement issues. There's no question that that material found its way before the relevant portfolio committee. But the problem seems to be what to do with that. What does one expect of the portfolio committee, and what does one expect of Parliament? And how does one use that in order to bring about the necessary improvements? Because I think it's a matter of public notoriety and its common cause that the problems of PRASA have not as yet been resolved. So perhaps if you could take that just as a case study to illustrate the propositions that you would advance in relation to the proper position, the proper function of the Chapter 9 institutions and of Parliament, principally through a portfolio committee.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. I turn to Section 181 of the Constitution, which is the first section under Chapter 9. The Chapter 9 institutions are listed there. The Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of Rights of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities, the CGE, the Commission for Gender Equality, the AG, the Auditor General, and the Electoral Commission, the IEC. You'll note that what used to be called the Independent Broadcast Authority, now ICASA, is not there. Now, neither is PRASA, nor is any of the state-owned enterprises. Eskom is not there, PRASA is not there. So the Constitution makes a distinction between bodies which are, let's say, directly related to the achievement of the values of the Constitution on the one hand, and other bodies. Now, there may be, I would argue, and I have argued orally, not in writing, that a body like ICASA, given the importance of the medium through which I'm giving evidence and we're holding this hearing today, given the importance of the electronic and other media, that a body like ICASA is closer, and it's a regulatory body rather than an executive body, although it takes executive and administrative decisions. A body like ICASA is closer to a Chapter 9 institution than is PRASA or Eskom or the SABC. There may therefore be, and ICASA is an example, there may be others, which to a certain extent stand closer to the Chapter 9 institutions, and therefore if there was to be set up a standing committee, a joint standing committee on Chapter 9 institutions, maybe ICASA should go that way, rather than report to the communications portfolio, which I assume it does at the moment in Parliament. But it seems to me appropriate that PRASA should report to the Transport Committee in Parliament, that Eskom should report to the Energy Committee in Parliament, or to whomever it does, and to the Minister of Public Enterprises, sorry, the Public Enterprises Committee, not the Energy Committee. Maybe it would be better reporting to the Energy Committee, the Mines and Energy Committee. But I think that having, let us say, the difficulties that we have seen and which have been recounted before this commission in relation to many of the state-owned enterprises. If the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee has had the first opportunity appropriately to engage with and seek accountability from the boards of those SOEs, but has failed to follow up or has failed to hold them to account, then it may well be for a Chapter 9 institution to take it on. But I would argue the first obligation under the Constitution rests with Parliament and its portfolio committees.
All right, thank you. Can I just follow up on that, Mr. Freund, before you proceed? Professor Koda, the point you make about Chapter 9 institutions following up or taking up issues that primarily you believe Parliament should tackle, raises a matter that crossed my mind when Mr. Lawson was giving evidence earlier on, so I'm thinking aloud. This is not something that I have had time to think about. But I've noted that the one committee which is not chaired by a member of the majority party, namely SCOPA, seems generally to be taken as having done quite well in terms of its performance of its oversight function and holding the executive accountable. So one has that point. And although I've had some evidence to the effect that, well, there are other parliamentary portfolio committees that have done
a fair amount of their job in terms of oversight that would be chaired by chairpersons who come from the majority party. SCOPA seems to stand out as a committee that seems to have done quite well. So if one looks at that, one asks the question, is it the presence on the chair of the committee of somebody who doesn't come from the majority party that makes the difference in the context of in SCOPA? Or is it the personality of the chairperson? Or is it a combination of both? Probably a combination of both. So one looks at that. And then one looks at the position that where, for example, a committee has decided to conduct an inquiry, such as the inquiry that we had into ESCOM and so on in Parliament by the Public Enterprises Committee, where the evidence leader was Mr. Vanara. Now, I understand that Mr. Vanara was not a member of Parliament. I don't know whether he was nevertheless from within the staff of Parliament or whether he was from outside. But it seems to me that if you bring in somebody to lead evidence in the context of such an inquiry, who might not be a member of Parliament and might not be a member of the majority party or might not be a member of any political party represented in Parliament, it may well be that that person might ask all the right questions that maybe even some of the members of the majority party might have wished to ask, but might fear that asking those questions might be career limiting. So those are two instances where there might be a role to be played by somebody who is not from the majority party or who is not a member of Parliament at all. So the question that I want to ask is whether there might be room for having somebody who comes into a committee when it appears that the particular committee has not performed its function properly in regard to a matter that is really of serious public interest, who could then ask all kinds of questions to the executive that maybe the majority members of the majority party don't feel comfortable to ask, and maybe if they are asked by the opposition parties, they are just poo-pooed and by the majority. I don't know whether such a person could be the chairperson, but without necessarily being a member of Parliament, or could be somebody that could be brought in, somebody who could make a decision to say, for example, on this issue of the proposal in 2016 that the DA made to say in the Public Enterprises Committee, let's have an inquiry into allegations that involved the Guptas. That was not agreed to by the majority at that time. And then if it is seen that that committee seems to have dropped the ball, or the majority didn't want to do its job, maybe somebody could be brought in who would be able to ask the difficult questions without fear or favor or prejudice. Obviously, what I'm saying is something that one hasn't thought out clearly, but one just notes that here is a committee, SCOPA, which is chaired by somebody who is not from the majority party, and it seems to do its oversight function reasonably well in circumstances where there are a number of portfolio committees chaired by people from the majority party that might not do so well. Of course, there might be others that did well. Do you have some thoughts, obviously, probably tentative thoughts about that? And it's not something that's fleshed out because it's not something one thinks about, has thought about.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, I would respectfully agree with your surmise early on that the fact that the chairperson is drawn not from the dominant party, combined with the personality of that chair, would provide the answer, because you can get compliant, non-questioning people in every, I would suggest, in every political party. So it's a combination of the two. But in my very cursory research in preparation for this hearing, Chair, I noted that within the American Congress, for example, and I hesitate to refer to the American constitutional experience, given the recent past, but there is a government accountability office within Congress, as I understand it. In other words, there is capacity which is specifically directed towards assisting Parliament to exercise its accountability duties, to fulfill its accountability duties. And this would be a statutory body, I suppose, or maybe a body within Parliament. And I would hope that it would be staffed by independent-minded, competent people who could fulfill the kind of role that you referred to in regard to the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee and the Evidence Leader and so on. The UK has a body within Parliament called the National Audit Office. That may relate more closely to the work in our dispensation of the Auditor General. But in principle, if there's a National Audit Office within the UK Parliament, there's no reason why there couldn't be a National Accountability Office within our own Parliament as a practical suggestion. One other point that just occurs to me, which I included in my affidavit, which I would just mention at this point, Chair, is that I noted that the National Assembly rules require a Member of Parliament who is not able to attend a portfolio committee meeting to seek leave for their absence from the chief whip of the party. And it seems to me that that's odd. It's logical from one point of view, because if the chief whip knows that MP X is going to be missing, they might want to supplement the membership with MP Y. But it indicates a locus of power to a certain extent within the portfolio committee structure, which does not lie with the chair, but which lies with the chief whip of the party.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Freund? Yes,
thank you, Chair. Professor Korda, the witness to follow you is an experienced observer of portfolio committees in their day-to-day ordinary work. And she will raise a number of very practical problems that inhibit effective oversight. And it seems to me that a great deal of your Accountability Standards Act, as proposed, is actually addressed at trying to resolve some of those problems. So I would like in the few minutes available to us, just to focus on some sort of nuts and bolts issues, which you propose in your act should be addressed, such as, and I'm really looking from page 281 and following of your affidavit as it's bundled in the Commission's bundling. And you propose that this Accountability Standards Act, Roman numerals 2, would set the broad framework and minimum requirements for accountability. 3, provide an authoritative and mandatory framework within which committee members can perform their oversight tasks. And then you go on elsewhere to talk about the questions of timing, when presentations should be submitted, that there should be standards against which accountability can be assessed. One needs to have standards in order to measure. And so if you could just talk briefly, obviously this is not a draft bill and we don't even have time comprehensively to deal with the issues. But if you could give the chair some sense of the flavor of what you think could be achieved by an Accountability Standards Act, which attempts to address some of the logistical and practical problems. Because at the end of the day, we have a relatively small number of MPs faced with a large volume of work for which they don't necessarily have particular expertise. And yet what we're trying to achieve is effective oversight. So if you could just talk briefly to some of the sort of pragmatic level of the proposals you made, which I would assume were informed by the observations you were making even then about the practical difficulties of exercising oversight.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I take as my really extremes in thinking about such legislation. On the one end of the spectrum would be the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which is a substantial act going into an enormous amount of detail, runs to many tens of pages. On the other hand, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act runs to less than 10 pages. So I would think that a statute that somehow managed to, I won't say straddle the divide, but be closer to the middle of the spectrum may be better. In other words, not so detailed and prescriptive, because I think it would be inappropriate to prescribe to Parliament too closely, given that these are the elected representatives of the people, of the people. But I would think that where one would have to start is precisely with the evidence that is going to be given next, which I have not seen, but engagement with parliamentarians, both currently and in the past, to find out from them what are the stumbling blocks. What makes it so difficult? I'm aware that there's a whole group of small minority parties in Parliament, and they are entitled to representation on all the portfolio committees. And if you've got 3 MPs for your party, they have to be spread among 20, 30 portfolio committees. They can't possibly do their work. It's just not physically possible or intellectually possible. So there needs to be the practical infrastructure within Parliament, and I would suggest the Office of the Speaker would be the one who would know best, and the Committee of Chief Whips would help in identifying also where the shortcomings are. And then it would be a matter of either amending the rules or including within the statutes which I have proposed, the establishment of that kind of infrastructure, and of course then one would have to find the budget for it. But my understanding is that the research capacity, for example, of Parliament has increased quite a lot over the past 20 years, and that's a thoroughly good thing. I hope that assists.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to take up one particular detail, which we find at the foot of page 286, where you propose prescribed reporting standards. Now, just by way of background, such evidence as I have seen and my investigations show that there is a profusion of material that is produced and placed before portfolio committees, very often in the form of PowerPoint presentations, very often at the 11th hour, and very often not in detail, which enables, as it were, exposure of problematic aspects, but a sort of broad overview generality. What you propose, we read this at the foot of page 286, is that you say accountability in its simplest form is linked to oral and written or electronic reports, but this should remain one of the main conduits for feeding information to Parliament. But it is obvious that absence of requirements and guidelines with which written reports must comply results in ineffective accountability. Reports may contain too much information, overwhelming the accounting body with a mass of detail, or may contain too little information to allow assessment of the body's performance. And you continue. Now, maybe with reference to that, you could, as it were, elaborate on the point that you were making, that if there is to be legislation, it needs, as it were, to be at an appropriate level. It needs to impose some type of useful rigor, but on the other hand, obviously not be overly prescriptive.
Yes, I don't have an enormous amount to add to the sentences from that bottom of page 286, which you have read. There is a reference there to, I'm afraid, a commission of inquiry that was held in the apartheid days, 1989, it reported. But I believe that the recommendations made by the Brown Commission contain the seeds of what would be required here. In other words, a broad brushstrokes framework for reporting, which would assist the departments of state in their reporting function. Because I can imagine that if I wouldn't be so high up as a DG, or the DG says to somebody in the department, please prepare a report for Parliament. They are not going to necessarily know what model to use, how much to include, how little to include, and so on and so on and so on. So some broad outline framework would be required. That is the nub of that recommendation.
All right. And finally, if I could take you to page 290. This is, as it were, towards the end of an overview on your section on amendatory accountability. And you deal in a series of bullet points with requiring certain information to be produced, but then you continue. With the support of a majority of the members of the committee to put the minister to terms in respect of remedial action to satisfy executive accountability, to stipulate appropriately urgent and regular report backs to the committee, to give appropriate publicity of these actions through the media to the broader electorate, to engage the Speaker of Parliament on her own or in consultation with the chief whips of the political parties represented in Parliament, to exert her authority as head of the legislature, and to intercede with the President as head of the National Executive to ensure compliance by ministers with the obligation to amend. Now, I take it that remains your view as it's contained in your report. Would you like to talk to that? Because this is an issue that has been canvassed with other witnesses, but it seems to me it's an issue of some considerable importance.
Thank you. That, in fact, was not in the quarter report. That is, as is indicated by the typeface, my current thinking in the preparation of this affidavit. But just the preceding paragraph, Chair, at the bottom of page 289, I would like to read it quickly so that one gets the context. So it's paragraph 9.7.1.3 at the bottom of page 289. And I quote, on the understanding that the primary focus for accountability would be through the committee system in Parliament, and in the knowledge that the committees are relatively well supported by research and administrative capacity, I'm hoping that that's the case. That may be wishful thinking, but I believe it to be the case. it could be provided, for example, that a significant number of the members of each committee, say at least 30%, so that frivolous or meddlesome inquiries do not cause bottlenecks, but not a majority, so that the apparently errant minister cannot be shielded by the representatives of the majority party alone, should be authorized to take some or all of the following steps. So this is an attempt to avoid, and I'm not saying it's applicable to us, but there is a well-known phrase called the tyranny of the majority, and I'm not saying that that applies in our country. I want to be very clear on that. But I am saying that a significant level of support, if shown within a portfolio committee, for the steps that you read then, which appear as bullet points on page 290, may be an example of a mechanism that could be introduced in an Accountability Standards Act or similar. But you started off with the bullet point, which is halfway down, which says with the support of a majority of the members of the committee. So what I'm suggesting there is that while 30% of the members of the committee may try to get some answers and some accountability, some explanation out of the minister in bullet points, the first and second, it would need the majority of the committee to put the minister to terms. And in doing so, I hope that I'm being nuanced enough to recognize the balance of political party power within Parliament. So that is the way that I would certainly stand by that set of proposals, but I recognize that it may not always be feasible. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, that's as far as I think I have time to take the matter, and I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Koda, for your input. We appreciate it. If later other issues arise concerning these matters, I'm sure you will avail yourself to further assist. Thank you very much. You are now excused.
Thank you, Chair, and I certainly will avail myself if requested. Thank you very much, and all good wishes to you and the Commission.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Freund?
Chair, there are two further witnesses, but I presume we take the lunch adjournment.
Yes, unless you think it would be a good idea for us to fast and skip lunch.
No, I don't mind doing that, but I think we should manage reasonably comfortably in the 2 hours
afternoon, yeah.
2 and 4 to get through the two remaining witnesses.
Okay, no, that's fine. Let's take the lunch adjournment. It's now 1:09. Let's resume at 2:10.
As you
We adjourn.